author of Paris Underwater, How the City of Light Survived the Great Flood of 1910, and Making Jazz French, Music in Modern Life in Interwar Paris, both of which have been received with high acclaim, as well as several edited collections and numerous articles. In 2011, Professor Jackson won the Clarence Day Award for Outstanding Research, Rhodes College's highest honor for faculty. Professor Jackson received his Bachelor's of Science in History summa cum laude with high honors from Vanderbilt University in 1993 and a PhD in History from the University of Rochester in 1999. At Rhodes, he teaches courses in modern European history, cultural history, French history, environmental studies, and interdisciplinary humanities. A gracious colleague, a generous mentor, and a good friend, it is my joy to now introduce to you Professor Jeffrey Jackson.
Well, thanks so much, Tate, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me tonight for the National Book Launch of Paper Bullets. Let's see, I hope everything is right here on my screen. I'm coming to you live from my office on the beautiful campus of Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. I wish, of course, that we could all be in person together, but thanks to the magic of the internet, many more of you can join in tonight than you could under normal circumstances. So I appreciate you taking the time to tune in. For about the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you a powerful story about resistance and perseverance in the face of grave danger that forms the heart of Paper Bullets. And I'll also read some selected excerpts from the book just to give you a sense of how I tell the story. I've lightly edited each of those excerpts and that I'll read tonight just for clarity. Now, as I talk, you can also ask questions at any time using the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen. They'll go to Tate Keller, who will receive them. And then when I'm finished speaking, he'll come back on screen and pose some of your questions directly to me. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to every question, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. And we'll end the webinar after approximately 1 hour. All right. Well, let me share my screen with you. I hope everyone can see that. And I want to, before I start, I want to thank some people for helping to spread the word tonight about this event and for helping to make this possible. I want to thank my co-sponsors, the Rhodes Office of Alumni Affairs, the Rhodes College Communities and Conversation series, especially my friend Jonathan Judekin, the Rhodes College Department of History, and the Rhodes College Program in Gender and Sexuality Studies, Facing History and Ourselves, both the Memphis office and also nationally, and my friends at the Alliance Française de Memphis. I also want to say a special thank you to the folks at Novel, which is a wonderful local bookstore here in Memphis, and they're the official bookseller for this event. Novel is selling signed copies of Paper Bullets, and if you order through their website, novelmemphis.com, you can request a signed copy. I'll be very happy to sign that and also to personalize it for you when I sign it. So just make a note in the comments section when you check out on the Novel website about how you'd like the book to be inscribed, and I'll be happy to do that. Of course, you can order the book from many places, both in person and online, including Apple Books, where it was named the best book for the month of November. But it's also so wonderful to be able to help support a local bookseller right here in Memphis, so Novel Books. Also, if you'd like to live tweet this event, you're certainly welcome to do so, and you can use the hashtag #PaperBullets. All right. So I want to begin by introducing you to two remarkable women. And if you know anything, something about art, the history of art, and especially the history of photography, then you may have heard of them. But even if you do know their work, you may not know much about the story of how and why they fought the Nazis for 4 years. Their story has really inspired me, and it's inspired lots of people that I've talked to about it over the years. And so I'm glad to be able to share it with you tonight. So please meet Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Malherbe, two of the most unlikely Nazi fighters that most of you have probably never heard of. They were Parisian artists. Lucy was a writer and Suzanne was an illustrator who had studied art in art school when she was young. Together, the two of them collaborated on what many people in their own day saw as some sometimes shocking photography. They were friends with and influenced by many of the great modern artists in Paris of their day: Picasso, André Breton, Salvador Dali, Jean Cocteau. But their images turned ideas of gender and identity on their heads. More than anything, that is what they're known for today. But after they left Paris and left the art world behind, they put their skills as artists to work fighting against the German army on the island of Jersey, one of the British Channel Islands. They used their creative powers to get inside the heads of soldiers. In brief, here's how it worked. Lucy and Suzanne created a PSYOPs campaign, a psychological operations campaign, designed to demoralize the soldiers, telling them that the war was a lost cause and trying to convince them to go home to their families. And they did it in a very unexpected way, with notes, messages, summaries of BBC News reports, drawings, songs, bawdy jokes, and provocative slogans, all written or typed on little slips of paper like the one you see on your screen, that they left for the Germans to find. In some cases, they even put their notes directly into the pockets of the soldiers themselves. So I want to begin here by reading the first excerpt to you from the book. This is the opening scene of the book, and it tells you more about how they went about this project of distributing their paper bullets. On the morning of July 25th, 1944, Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Malherbe went into Saint-Hélier to do some shopping. The trip was part of their regular routine. Outside the offices of the Jersey Evening Post, they glanced up at the large clock at the top of the building. Suzanne leaned in and whispered to Lucy to keep watch. Then Suzanne scanned the long row of police cars the Nazi occupation forces always parked along Charles Street, a reminder of how heavily the Germans censored the island's only newspaper. Suzanne took a small piece of paper out of her pocket and began moving carefully toward one of the police cars as Lucy stood by on lookout duty. Suzanne stuck the gummed paper on the windshield. It read, "The cowardly bureaucrats of the police who live on lies and shameful cruelty will be destroyed by the soldiers with no names." No one seemed to be paying any attention to the middle-aged women in Burberry trench coats with bright scarves tied around their heads. Suzanne quickly attached papers to a few more windshields and casually strolled away, her Wellington boots thumping on the pavement. If anyone asked the women what they were doing, their shopping bag would provide a ready alibi. After finishing their secret mission, along with some mundane errands, they met up with their housekeeper, Edna, and boarded one of the wood-burning buses to head back home on the other side of the island. Lucy held a package of cigarette papers that they had bought at the newsstand. These papers were destined to become a new batch of notes for the Nazis. In her pocket, alongside more of their notes, Suzanne could feel the bright blue milk of magnesia bottle. It did not contain the digestive medicine, however, but instead an overdose of the powerful barbiturate Gardinol, in case the Germans caught them in the act. With no warning, the bus came to an abrupt halt, and a fair-haired soldier climbed aboard. Everyone off the bus. Lucy clutched her parcel a bit tighter. Outside, the soldier approached each commuter. Suzanne noticed his bright blue eyes. "Please show me your papers. How old are you? What is your occupation? Where were you born? Where do you live? How many children do you have?" With his critical eye, the German carefully looked over each passenger's documents until satisfied, saying very little other than what was necessary to get his answers. If something was suspicious, or if passengers had forgotten their documents, they were told, "Someone will visit you in your home." Then the soldier approached Lucy and Suzanne. Lucy recalled the scene several years later in a scrapbook of notes that might have formed the basis of a memoir if she had lived long enough. She titled these reminiscences, "The Mute in the Middle of the Muddle." "Show me your registration card," the German demanded. He stood in front of Lucy, glaring at her. A look of recognition crossed his face when he saw a familiar name, Schwab. "What kind of name is that?" The document listed French as her national origin. She explained nervously that she was an orphan and raised by a Frenchman. "Perhaps you were an Alsatian." "Maybe," she replied, but admitted that she didn't really know. Lucy stated that she had been on Jersey for some 30 years. Nearly everything she had just told the German about herself was a calculated lie. She invented a new backstory for herself, and not for the first time. As the minutes ticked by, Lucy waited patiently next to the bus and watched the soldier scrutinize her documents. Suzanne and Edna were close by but could do nothing to help. Lucy, perhaps coughing or stumbling a bit, played sick for the Germans' benefit, brushing off her acting skills from her Paris days when she took part in avant-garde theater productions. Finally, the soldier handed back Lucy's papers. When he wrapped up his examination of all the passengers, everyone reboarded the bus. An acquaintance riding with them tried to break the nervous tension created by the ordeal. "They have not caught you this time," she said, laughing, unaware of what Lucy's parcel of cigarette papers was destined for. Now, I'll tell you more about how they did all of this in a moment, but first I want to tell you a little bit about their background, because one of the questions that I had to think about was, why would two women with so much to lose put their lives on the line in the way that they did? And also, what was it about who they were that gave them the strength and the power to become resistors? After all, most people did not become resistors during World War II. Part of the answer to those questions, I think, lies in their personal histories. Lucy and Suzanne grew up around the turn of the 20th century in the southern French city of Nantes as daughters of wealth and privilege. Lucy's father was a newspaper owner and editor, and Suzanne's was the head of the medical school and a well-known physician. They were never starving artists, even when they moved to Paris as young women in their 20s, just after World War I, to pursue their artistic careers, because they always had family resources. One reason they did not become famous in their day, even in the art world, is that they never really needed to publicize their work to make money. They were known in certain circles, such as among the surrealists with whom they were friends, but for decades they were largely forgotten until being rediscovered in the 1980s. Yet to become resistors, they would need to give up the privilege and comfort they were born with. But why would they? Well, there were some key things about their life stories, which, although they did not know it at the time, would set the stage for their resistance against the Nazis. First, Lucy's father's family was Jewish. Although he was assimilated and didn't practice the faith, Lucy embraced elements of her Jewish identity that were taught to her by her grandmother. There were also several rabbis and scholars of Jewish life in the family. Lucy was 4 years old at the height of one of the worst anti-Semitic episodes in modern French history, the Dreyfus Affair. Now, that's a complicated story and we don't have time to go into it tonight, but it led to crowds outside the family's apartment shouting, "Down with the Jews." Later, when Lucy was 12, she was attacked by other children in school who pelted her with rocks and anti-Semitic taunts while she lay helpless on the ground. Lucy and Suzanne both would remember those horrible days, and the memory would fuel their hatred of fascism and their willingness to fight it. A second factor that allowed them to become resistors was the fact that they were in love. Lucy and Suzanne had met as young girls in the elite circles of Nantes society and played together from childhood. By the time they were teenagers, they began a relationship that was in tension with a conservative French Catholic society that valued respectability. Most people in France at the turn of the century did not see a lesbian couple as respectable. Their connection was made even more complicated by the fact that in 1917, Lucy's divorced father married Suzanne's widowed mother, making the girls stepsisters. But their feelings were powerful. Lucy wrote in a thinly veiled article published in a Nantes-based literary journal that her feelings for Suzanne were her idée maîtresse, her main idea, and her guiding principle. "I am in her, she is in me, and I will follow her always, never losing sight of her." And if you notice in this image here on the right-hand side of your screen, you see at the top their initials, LS and SM, that they've run together. This is a drawing that Lucy did. So all of their initials are there, but they've been merged into one. And when you read those letters LSM phonetically in French, it creates the sentence elles s'aiment, which means they love each other. And drawing on their own experiences, Lucy and Suzanne also explored gender and sexuality as fluid and changing categories. This is one of the things that they're most famous for today. In fact, they're not known in the art world as Lucy and Suzanne, but rather by the gender-neutral artistic names which they took, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. Now, in French, her name should be pronounced Claude Cahun, but most English speakers, especially in the United States, say Claude Cahun, and so that's the pronunciation I'll use tonight. They assume these names, Cahun and Moore, to obscure their identities and also to cross gender lines. Claude, in particular, is a name used by both men and women in French. Cahun put it this way in a memoir she published in 1930, "Masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me. If it existed in our language, no one would be able to see my thoughts' vacillation." Lucy's new name also allowed her to express her Jewishness. Cahun was the name of one set of Lucy's grandparents, in particular the grandmother who taught her about Judaism. Cahun is the French version of Cohen, the Hebrew word for priest. Like many other artists of their day, they created work under these new names, but these identities also allowed the women to slip the trap of traditional bourgeois society. Yet they always still called one another Lucy and Suzanne. Those are the names on their tombstone. Now, if you've seen their work under the names Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, you know the ways in which their photographs depict Cahun, Lucy, in gender ambiguous dress or pose, playing with notions of masculinity and femininity, in some ways helping to invent the notion of what we now call queerness long before our current understanding of that idea was created. In fact, many queer and transgender people today see them as early heroes and role models. Their photos deconstructed gender categories, showing them to be masquerade and performance, decade before most scholars would take up those questions. Cahun put it this way in her autobiography: "I shave my head, wrench out my teeth, my breasts, anything that is embarrassing or annoying to look at, stomach, ovaries, the brain, conscious and covered in cysts," suggesting that altering gender and sexual identity was part of the goal, and so was creating a new self. Musician David Bowie, well known for his own gender ambiguity, mentioned a 2007 show, posthumous show, of Cahun and Moore's photography on his blog. He wrote, "I find this work really quite mad in the nicest way." Now, that ability to cross gender lines would also become crucial to Lucy and Suzanne's fight against the Nazis, so keep that in mind. Lucy and Suzanne spent the 1920s and most of the 1930s in Paris, but they decamped to the island of Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, in 1937, when they were both in their late 40s. They had vacationed on Jersey many times over the years, so its beaches and its natural beauty were familiar to them. And on a personal note, I spent some time on Jersey doing the research for this book, and it is a beautiful place. It's wonderful. And this is the beach that you're looking at right here outside their home. There's their home on the left-hand side of the screen. I visited this place. It's a beautiful place, and I can certainly understand why they would want to move there. It's wonderful. Jersey was also a perfect respite for Lucy's chronic ill health. She had a number of medical conditions through which Suzanne had helped to nurse her over the years. And also Paris had become so deeply polarized by the 1930s, with various groups literally fighting in the streets. And with fascism on the rise across Europe, Jersey offered a peaceful escape. So when they left Paris and they left the art world behind, they by and large stopped using the names Cahun and Moore, and they returned almost exclusively to their birth names, Lucy and Suzanne. Little did they know that when they moved to Jersey, they were stepping into what would soon become a war zone. When the fighting broke out in Poland in 1939, Jersey seemed far away from the action, but by 1940, the Channel Islands would become the front lines. The islands were the only piece of British soil that the Nazis conquered, and they were crucial to what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall, a line of defense in the West designed to keep the Allies at bay. And you can see that on the map on the left-hand side, and the role or the place of the Channel Islands in that Atlantic Wall. Thousands of German troops soon arrived in Lucy and Suzanne's adopted home to build fortifications which would be used to protect the continent from Allied assault. It was so important that Hitler personally received regular updates from the islands. No dissent could be tolerated in such a strategically important location. But dissent is exactly what Lucy and Suzanne did. Back in Paris, they had been involved in left-wing politics, befriending communists and other radicals. They had signed petitions and opened letters against the rise of fascism and protesting anti-immigrant legislation. Lucy had written a letter to a magazine supporting gay rights. So by the time they arrived on Jersey, they had been rebels for some time. Add to that their own lives as lesbian partners lived in opposition to the mores of their day, and their provocative artwork that challenged notions of beauty and gender identity. Ultimately, all of the strands of their lives came together to not only give them the strength to resist the German occupation of Jersey, but to give them the skills to do so. They put their creative talents, their political inclinations, and their personal backgrounds into their work, and it gave them the tools to fight back. Resistance was not an afterthought, but the peak and the point of their creative lives. Most importantly, their love kept them going as they supported one another through what were some very scary and very stressful moments. I really don't believe that either woman alone could have done this work. Just like their art, their resistance was something that came out of their relationship and their love. Now, as I said before, their desire to resist led them to write notes to the Nazis, something that on the face of it seems small and even inconsequential. But the notes they wrote were powerful indeed. All of these messages were designed to demoralize the troops or to convince them to desert or to mutiny or to go back to their families in Germany. And the German army took them very seriously. For 4 years, the secret field police, which was tasked with keeping order in occupied territory, tracked them, trying to find out who was leaving all of these notes around the island. Sometimes the agents would find them on fence posts, sometimes on cafe tables, sometimes tucked into magazines and newsstands, sometimes placed inside German staff cars parked along the street, sometimes, as I said before, even in their own pockets. The women even hung a sarcastic banner over the altar at the church near their house where some of the German soldiers worshiped, reading, "Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater, because Jesus died for people, but people die for Hitler." Now, what they were doing with these messages was scaring the German command into believing that a conspiracy was afoot on the island, this strategically important zone about which Hitler received regular updates. Was there someone on the island threatening the Atlantic Wall that protected Hitler's conquered continent from Allied attack? The notes only served to stoke the Germans' paranoia. And now I want to read a second excerpt for you from the book. This is the story of their arrest. During a quiet dinner, a fist pounded at the door. It was the moment Lucy and Suzanne had been expecting every day for nearly 4 years. The only question was whether the Germans were clever enough to have discovered the women on their own, or if someone had ratted them out. Suzanne got up from the table, walked to the door, and pulled it open. Having studied these men carefully from afar for a long time, Lucy and Suzanne knew that they would not be smiling. 5 men stood on their doorstep, including Chief of the Secret Field Police, Captain Bode, and a fair-haired man with bright blue eyes who wore mustard-colored +4s. Suzanne greeted them with a simple "good evening." With a surprising graciousness, the fair-haired man clicked his heels and made a deep, respectful bow from the hips. "German secret police," Suzanne remembered him announcing politely. "We come to search your house." Bode strode to the window seat and made himself comfortable, perhaps puffing on his cigar, while the fair-haired man, whom the others called Carl, started to run excitedly back and forth throughout the house. They ransacked every corner, pulling out all the drawers, prying into every nook and cranny of Suzanne's lives. From his perch, Bode watched with suspicion as the 2 tired women, their faces slightly wrinkled and hair graying, stood by. "Too late," Lucy announced in English, knowing that these men did not speak French and herself unable to speak much German. "Germany has already lost the war," she proclaimed. Lucy and Suzanne remained calm, but their maid Edna panicked as the men ravaged the house. She knew everyone in the household had been breaking German regulations by hoarding food. Perhaps she worried that she had let something slip about the radio. Carl came over to Lucy and stared down at her. "And what do you think will happen to you? You tell me that," he shouted, his calm and polite demeanor at the door now gone as the adrenaline from the thrill of the chase pumped through him. "I think that probably you will torture us and shoot us afterward," Lucy flatly replied, as though she had always known and accepted that this would be the outcome. Carl was stunned silent. These women were not hysterical or even surprised by a raid on their house, but were already anticipating their own deaths. I believe until that moment, he had thought us unaware of the risks we had been taking, Suzanne reflected. Carl looked at Bode, then back at Lucy and Suzanne. "But we never do that kind of thing," he proclaimed indignantly. "That is BBC propaganda." Lucy glanced back at him, raising her eyebrow in disbelief. Now, the notes that frightened the Germans so much were not, the notes that frightened the Germans the most were the ones that Lucy and Suzanne signed, but they didn't sign with their own name. They signed with the name of an author that they had invented. They created a fictional persona and pretended to write messages from that perspective in German, since Suzanne was fluent. But the persona was significant. They called him the soldier with no name. In other words, they crossed gender lines once again, this time in effect becoming a German soldier. When they wrote notes in this male German voice aimed at the other soldiers, they made the secret police believe that the threat was coming from within the German army itself. This was one of their innovations. Note writing was not unique to them. There are many cases of people living in German occupied territory and even within Nazi Germany itself, writing notes as a form of dissent. But most of those notes were aimed at the civilian population, reminding them to keep up their spirits or calling on them to resist the Nazis. As far as I can tell, Lucy and Suzanne were unique as civilians aiming their notes at the German soldiers themselves. The only real parallel was the Allied PSYOPs campaign, which dropped German language leaflets behind enemy lines, encouraging soldiers to desert or to surrender. What Lucy and Suzanne were doing here was rewriting the inner script, or what the political theorist James C. Scott calls the hidden transcript, that the Germans told themselves about how the war was going. They were getting inside the minds of the soldiers and sowing seeds of doubt and dissension, spreading ideas that they hoped would go viral, so to speak, among the troops. In fact, someone I was talking with recently about this likened them to internet memes that go viral. If a German read their notes, signed by this soldier with no name, and believed that they really were written by a comrade, then Lucy and Suzanne hoped he might think twice about what he was doing on Jersey. Maybe he would even mutiny or desert. Now, of course, I don't have time to tell you the whole story here tonight, but suffice it to say that they were indeed arrested by the secret field police, as we heard in the last excerpt. They were interrogated, and they were put on trial on November 16th, 1944, 76 years ago next week. They were then sent to prison, and they were sentenced to death. And now I want to read an excerpt from the book about the trial that they underwent. The judges and lawyers convened in large imitation leather armchairs on one side of the table. Lucy and Suzanne's chairs, placed opposite the Germans, were so large that the women could not use the armrests without spreading themselves unnaturally wide. So Suzanne rested her hands in her lap. Lucy, thinned by illness and lack of nourishment, was curled up in one corner of her chair like a child who climbed in a seat made for a large adult. Behind them were 2 rows of spindly gilt cane chairs. Captain Boda, wearing a white jacket and smoking his cigar, balanced on one of them. On a table lay all the items confiscated during the raid on their house, including the Philips radio, their Underwood typewriter, their Kodak camera, 2 guns, books, articles published by Lucy's father, one of Suzanne's wooden crosses that Lucy had planted on a soldier's fresh grave, pieces of fabric, and a few of the coins on which the women had painted "Down with War" in nail polish. These once familiar things now seemed strange, so out of context in a courtroom rather than at home. This collection looks like a sort of junk shop, Lucy wryly thought. Also on the table sat Boda's fat file, which was packed with their notes. The approximately 300 scraps of paper now entered into evidence were only a fraction of what they had produced, 1/20th, Lucy claimed. Her estimate was different from what Suzanne recalled, but of course, neither had really been counting. The other noteworthy feature in the room was the 3/4 length portrait of Hitler that hung over the fireplace. He appeared to be presiding over the trial. Lucy recalled the large windows of the courtroom filled with the sunshine from the beautiful day outside, even describing the room as hot. What a luxury, she thought, compared with their cold prison cells. 2 large, comfortable armchairs in the front row next to one another. What a delight. We are at the show, Lucy remembered with more than a bit of sarcasm. The decor, the actors did not disappoint us. Rather than reading the indictment or inviting the prosecutor to begin, the chief judge, Oberstabsrichter Harmsen, began by questioning Lucy and Suzanne in German about their responses during their interrogations. Then he asked about some of the evidence he felt had been ignored, peppering the women with a string of additional queries. Any previous convictions, Harmsen asked? Have you ever appeared before a court? Never, Lucy answered, never, Suzanne answered in German, speaking for both herself and Lucy. Harmsen turned the proceedings over to the prosecutor, Lieutenant Lung, so that he could make the formal case against the women, and for the next few hours, he did just that. Lung began by focusing on several of their leaflets and messages to the German troops. One of those was their darkly funny version of a heroic song. The interrogator had asked them about it, and Suzanne had not denied that it crudely shamed German women and embarrassed German men. Lung read the song in its entirety to the court. The refrain joked, "And when I came home on leave, my wife was pregnant. Don't be cross, my little boy," she said. "The fatherland needs soldiers." "This is an insult to German womanhood," Harmsen declared. One of the other judges, deeply offended, refused to look at Lucy and Suzanne. "By no means," Suzanne protested. "I have simply tried to show the kind of situation that would arise if a woman actually followed the directives of the party." The men at the table sat silently as Harmsen shuffled his papers. "Perhaps I should have made it clear that the father of the many children the song went on to mention was always an Aryan," she quipped slyly. Harmsen put the leaflet down and picked up another. When it came time to pass sentence, Harmsen was blunt. "You are franc-tireur," he declared, using the French term for guerrilla fighters or irregular military shooters, even though you used spiritual arms instead of firearms. He gave a brief summary on why their actions were so significant and why he had condemned them as dangerous political criminals. "It is indeed a more serious crime," he claimed. With firearms, one knows at once what damage has been done, but with spiritual arms, one cannot tell how far-reaching it may be. Lucy could not help but think, we couldn't have put our defense any better ourselves. Now, even during their time in prison, Lucy and Suzanne kept up their efforts at defying the Nazis as they befriended guards, they passed notes, and they comforted other prisoners. The book is full of surprising episodes about what took place in these moments behind bars. German guards, both frightening and humane, prisoners keeping one another's spirits up with singing, Lucy and Suzanne smuggling notes to one another, tales of German deserters being hauled off to their execution, leaving the women to wonder when their turn before the firing squad would come. But there's one story in particular that stands out because I think it highlights how important their relationship, their love story, was to making all of this happen. As Lucy was being interrogated by the secret police, she made a stunning admission. She blurted out, "I am on my father's side of Jewish origin." She admitted to being an unregistered Jew living in Nazi-occupied territory, thereby putting herself in grave danger. Then she confessed to the supposed crime, telling her interrogator that she wrote all the notes by herself and that the whole thing was her idea. She was trying to convince her interrogators that she alone had the motive to become the soldier with no name. But in reality, she was not claiming credit for their work as the true mastermind behind the campaign, as some scholars have believed. In fact, Lucy knew just how much of their resistance Suzanne was responsible for. Lucy wrote that it was more often me who accompanied Suzanne, she who took the initiative, which required the most sang-froid. Instead, Lucy's calculated risk in admitting her Jewishness was an attempt to take the fall and save Suzanne. If the police believed that Lucy alone had the motive to write their notes, then the woman she loved might somehow get off. Lucy and Suzanne survived the war, but they had to work hard to make sense of it. What had it all meant? After all, they did not drive the Germans from Jersey with their notes, but in some very important, very personal ways, their effort was a success. And it's something that speaks to us today, I think, about the power of creativity and imagination and persistence, especially in trying times. I think they've left us a story about how even small acts of protest and refusal can have significant effects that are hard to see until later. And I think they remind us why history matters, because in the midst of our present day difficulties, a pandemic, deep political polarization, economic uncertainty, we can look back to the stories of people who had it far worse, but still somehow survived. Now, I want to close with one final excerpt from the book where I talk about how Lucy and Suzanne tried to make sense of what they had gone through. After the war, one day in Saint-Hélier, Lucy and Suzanne encountered a woman whom they had never met before. She stopped them and proclaimed, "I'm so happy to see you alive." Several others also gathered around to greet Lucy and Suzanne. They were in disbelief to learn that the women had survived their ordeal. "It must have been a dreadful experience," the woman continued. "Now you must forget all about it." Lucy and Suzanne were left dumbfounded by her blithe advice. Later, Lucy sat on her bed, leafing through a stack of papers. Next to her on a small table where she placed her tea tray sat the square hat box one of the German guards had given to her last August as a place to keep her personal items. Other than her memories, the miscellaneous mementos inside this box were all she had left of their months behind bars. "Of all our baggage," she said, "the hat box was the only one that had any value." She determined that she would organize all the prison communications, letters, drawings, notes between her and Suzanne. Few of the documents from their earlier lives had survived the occupation of their home by Germans. She speculated that the soldiers had used them to light fires in the fireplace. Lucy gave some papers to a friend on Jersey, and she sent a few other items to friends back in Paris, but the ones with the most personal meaning did not leave that box. The memories were too precious. When Lucy couldn't sleep, she reread the notes Suzanne had written to her during their prison stay, some of them on sanitary napkins, and felt strangely nostalgic. But as the days went on, her thoughts began to darken. Lucy had always been the more pessimistic of the two, prone to depression and suicidal feelings, and her gloomier meditations in the aftermath of the war echoed that part of her personality. She later wrote about how she had become possessed in those days by an overwhelming fear that all her struggles had been for nothing, that there were no greater lessons to learn from all the experiences that she had lived through: Suzanne's suicide attempt, their home plundered, illness, death. In the months after the war, they even had to put their beloved cat to sleep. Lucy likened herself in her reminiscences to a repeat offender Lazarus, rising from the dead over and over, only to witness still more suffering. Throughout the years that followed, she wrote about the war in lengthy letters to friends and in early drafts of what might have become a memoir had she lived longer. These writings were not the sort of quest for personal identity that she had composed as a young woman in the 1920s and 1930s, but were rather an attempt to make sense of what the war and their time in prison had meant in broader, more universal terms, despite her underlying fear that there was no such meaning to be made. But there had been a point to what they did. Lucy wrote in a 1950 letter, "From July 1940, the invasion of Jersey, until May 1945, the liberation of the Channel Islands, yes, even in prison, even in secret, I wrote to encourage men, including the German soldiers, to liberate themselves." Whether such self-liberation took place was easy to doubt. Yet there were occasional glimpses of something that might offer a larger perspective and a sense, perhaps, of vindication. In January 1946, for example, Suzanne received a letter in German from a POW military hospital. It was from Heinrich Ebers, one of the men who had guarded Lucy and Suzanne in prison. Surely German jailers did not typically write to their former inmates. His family was alive and in good health, he reported, and the British were treating him well. He asked Suzanne to greet Lucy and to write him back. In some strange way, perhaps Heinrich, the German guard, had liberated himself and wanted them to know it. Lucy and Suzanne had liberated themselves through their resistance work too. Lucy in particular had struggled with the question of identity her whole life, from her youth in an assimilated Jewish household during the heat of the Dreyfus Affair, to her struggles with her mother's mental illness and her own poor health. Her early writings as Claude Cahun were inwardly focused and tortured, an extended attempt to answer the question, who am I? Which neither her book nor her evolving self-presentation, her numerous aliases, and her radical politics could ever seem to resolve. She was always looking for more. Lucy finally found her identity through The Soldier with No Name, and so did Suzanne. The war was the one moment in their lives when they seemed to have the strongest sense of purpose and the most direct vision about who they wanted to be. Against the Nazis, there was a moral clarity and certainty, which their earlier work did not always have. The Soldier with No Name finally liberated themselves to speak as loudly and distinctly as they wanted. Well, thank you so much for listening tonight, and we'll have some questions here in just a second. Tate Keller will come back here and pose some of the questions that you've written in the Q&A. But before we do that, I just wanted to let you know that I've got a series of other events coming up. If you want to hear more, or if you want to hear me in a different context, you're certainly welcome to join in. The one on Thursday at Parnassus Books in Nashville will be more of a conversation with my old friend, Vanderbilt Professor Michael Bess. That's on Thursday, but you can see a number of other things throughout the coming weeks and some more that are still being scheduled. So feel free to join. You can find all the information on my website, jeffreyhjackson.com. You can follow me on Twitter. And of course, you can order signed copies from our good friends at Novel Books at novelmemphis.com. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Tate Keller to come back and pose some questions from the audience or questions that you may have, Tate.
Thanks so much, Jeff. That was fascinating. What a fascinating story. It's incredible the treasures we find when we look in these little corners of the war, these hidden figures. We have a question about how did you come across this story? How did you find these hidden figures?
Well, it's a great question. And I came to this through their photography. As I showed you some of the images that they are well known for, especially among folks who are art historians and who study the history of photography. I have to, of course, give credit to my wife, Ellen, who has taught, she's an art historian and taught history of photography for many years here in Memphis. And she was the first one who showed me their work, showed me the photographs, and we discussed it. And she knew a little bit about the story of their anti-Nazi resistance, but really didn't know much about it. So I began to look, to investigate. I was fascinated by the images. And as I started reading, I realized that although some scholars had written a little bit about their wartime experience, it was really not something that had been explored in great detail. So I decided to explore that further. And And as you say, it turned out to be a really fascinating story. They are very much, I think, hidden figures in a lot of ways, even to the people who know their artwork, who know their photography. As I say, it's not necessarily something that's been as explored as much. So I hope that this book will fill that gap and to really round out their story, because it seems to me that their artwork from the 20s and 30s really, you have to sort of see this long trajectory. I think that the wartime experience is very much part and parcel of that. And so for me, as I look at what they did during the war, it helps me better understand the photographs that they did in the 20s and 30s, as well as their writing and illustration. Really, Lucy was a writer. Suzanne was an illustrator. Those are the primary ways that they identified as artists. Suzanne was the one who had been to art school, but then they began to collaborate on this artwork in the 20s and 30s. And that's what has really sort of become their hallmark.
Wonderful. We have a question regarding if you could perhaps speak to what was Suzanne's motivation for getting involved?
That's a great question. And when you read the whole book, you sort of see the kind of dilemma or the kind of conflict or the tension there, because in many ways, Lucy was the one who really wanted to do this resistance work. She was the one who was pushing it. She was probably of the two, the more politically engaged, although they certainly were both politically engaged. Lucy was in some ways, I think, much more politically engaged. And given her past, given her experience with anti-Semitism in France, I think that she was the one who really wanted to be more forceful in pushing back against the Nazis. And so when Lucy began to say, let's do something to fight the Nazis, initially Suzanne was hesitant. Suzanne was always the more practical one. And she was always described by friends as the more down to earth, the more pragmatic, the more practical one. She was the caretaker. She was the one who took care of Lucy all those years with Lucy's chronic illnesses. And so there really was, a kind of hesitation on Suzanne's part, because there was just a sense that, is this a good idea? Should we be doing this? Should we be risking ourselves? But I think what happened was that Suzanne saw Lucy's passion and was drawn in by it. And also, understood Lucy was going to do this probably in some way, better for the two of them to do it together, and for it to really come from their relationship. And so I think that's why I say I don't think either of them could have done it alone. Lucy wanted to, but I think she really needed Suzanne's practical mind and practical mindset to be able to actually undertake the work. And I don't know that Suzanne would have done it had it not been for Lucy's passion. So they really sort of complemented each other. And I think that's part of why as I say, the relationship really was so important.
Yes. As historians, we dig deep into these projects that we're working on. We're mining archives and libraries and what other evidence and primary sources we might find. And one of the questions that came, and this is an interesting one for us to ponder as historians, is how did the lives of these two women change you along the way? What did they leave you with?
Well, that's a really great question. And I think, maybe I alluded to it a little bit sort of towards the end there, but I think that this is such a story of persistence. It's such a story of, it sort of makes you ask, what does it take for someone to step out? What does it take for somebody to be, to go from that place of being a bystander to being an upstander, to taking action? When you think about it, most people, as I said at the beginning, most people did not become resistors during the war. And I often ask students in class when I teach fascism or I teach World War II, would you have become a resistor? Would you have fought the Nazis? And of course, most people like to say, yes, I would have done it. But in reality, very few people really would have, because there's so many things to protect. And so I think that, for me, it was a way to kind of think about, what is important? What are my values about democracy, about, how I would approach that. And I don't know, I can't say that I would have done, what they did, because I think what they did is truly remarkable, but it does sort of beg that question, right? It sort of forces us all to kind of rethink, what is our place? What is our relationship to oppression, to the kind of ethical and moral dilemmas that they faced? I think another thing too that it brought to me was kind of thinking again about the importance of hearing many voices.
Mm.
You know, we often talk about the war, I think, more as a top-down experience. We think about dramatic battles and tanks rolling across and air battles, and those are very important, obviously. But when we hear these voices at ground level, that's something I always try to do in my research and also in my teaching, is to think about what's going on at ground level. I think that you hear things from a different perspective. And I think, to me, this just sort of reinforces the idea that hearing history at ground level really opens up some different ways of thinking about something, even something as momentous and something as enormous as World War II.
Terrific. One question came across was that about motivation, or if we're able to get into the minds of your protagonists. Did they think that they would actually make a difference in this war? Was this motivated by a sense that they wanted to resist in some way, even if they didn't expect success?
I don't know that they truly expected that they would somehow drive the Germans from Jersey. I think that is probably overstating it. But I don't know that that really mattered to them. I think for them, it was about taking a stand, regardless of what the outcome would be. I think it was about saying, we detest fascism, we detest everything that it stands for, we resist it, and we're going to do our best, we're going to do what we can. But I don't know that I mean, it's hard to know. It's very hard to know if they truly believe that they would somehow single-handedly, so to speak, drive the German forces from Jersey. I think for them, it was more about responding to the ethical situation, the ethical dilemma, and saying that no matter what happens from this, we have to do what we can. We have to take a stand. And we don't know what the outcome will be. I think they hoped that it would have an effect. And indeed, I think it did. You know, I think the way that the Germans talked to them and about them, the fact that they were hunted for 4 years, for example, tells you something, right? I mean, the Germans took this seriously. And then in the trial, when they were being sentenced, they were, you know, as I said, they were being sentenced essentially as guerrilla fighters, because the Germans understood that morale was really crucial, especially on this place that was such a strategically important zone. So, so it was, you know, it was not a small thing. It was not a small act. It seems small. It appears small. That's part of, again, what's so interesting to me about the story, is that it seems like something that's completely marginal. And yet, clearly, the secret field police did not think that this was marginal. They spent a lot of manpower and hours and energy trying to find whoever was writing these notes. They didn't know, in particular, because they thought it was coming from within their own ranks.
There's a lot of fluidity that's happening in this story that you've discussed with us. How did you find that when it came to your methodology of doing this type of work, or putting it into a coherent narrative as you thought about framing this story or telling this story?
Well, I think in some ways this was one of the most challenging research projects that I've undertaken, and I think that part of that had to do with the nature of the sources themselves. So when you look at what remains, as I said, a lot of their stuff was destroyed, an awful lot of their stuff, and so I think most of what remains is really things that were written after the war, looking back. But even that rich material, and it is very rich, they wrote a lot, it was in sort of bits and pieces. So among Suzanne's papers, for example, which form an awful lot of the second half of the book, she would write some thoughts, and then she would draw a line on the paper, and then she would write some more thoughts underneath it, and then she'd draw a line on the paper, and then she would write some more thoughts and draw a line. And none of those thoughts were connected to each other. They were all sort of separate thought processes, separate ideas. So I had to sort of take these, what were in many ways kind of stream of consciousness reminiscences, and to try to put it together into some kind of coherent narrative. And it was very challenging, and it was very tricky. And trying to then think about the connections between the war experience and the pre-war experience, about which a lot has been written. A lot of people have talked about, scholars have talked about their experiences in the 20s and 30s and their art and so forth, their photography. Trying to weave all that together it was very challenging, and I hope that I've done it. I hope that people find it a compelling read. But I think it was probably one of the hardest research projects that I've ever undertaken.
It sounds like it would be. It certainly does sound that way. Incredible story. Another question came up here about resistance, or the nature of resistance, or um, how to what extent people knew about the resistance on did the residents of Jersey, was this an open secret in a way among those in the know, or not so much?
That's a good question. And of course, I talk about this extensively in the book, that Lucy and Suzanne are not the only resistors on Jersey. There are other people engaged in various levels of resistance. And that's certainly also the case you see in other occupied territories. There are levels of resistance. There are people who are doing very serious, highly organized, engaged work. And then there are people who are doing sort of the occasional sabotage or something that's in a much more informal way. That was true on Jersey as well. There were people like Lucy and Suzanne who were doing something systematic, something regular, something that had a plan behind it. There were other people who were just doing, different kinds of things, hoarding food, or maybe stealing from the Germans, or doing various things. What's interesting, so a large part of the population on Jersey was engaged in some form or other in some kind of dissident or resistance kind of activity. At the same time, an awful lot of the population on Jersey was also working for the Germans. I mean, after all, this was occupied territory, and they had to a certain extent, collaborate if they wanted to survive, if they wanted, things to have a relatively normal life. So the population was in a very tricky situation, and the leadership of the island surrendered immediately and tried to mediate between the occupation and, people keeping a normal life. Part of what's interesting, and people who study the history of the occupation of Jersey point this out, I think it's a very important point, that there was really no sort of coordinated resistance on Jersey in the same way that you might think about, say, the French resistance. That, whether that be the French resistance that's being organized by Charles de Gaulle in London and supported, or whether that's sort of ground level Maquis resistance in the countryside. Either way, on Jersey, even though there were people doing this sort of organized work, they weren't connected together. So a lot of these were sort of spontaneous or decentered acts of resistance. And the reason for that is it's a small island, and people sort of recognized that there wasn't really any way to coordinate without running into the secret field police. And they also couldn't rely on any kind of support from people on the continent. There was no way they could connect with resistance movements in France, or no way they could connect with de Gaulle in London or anywhere else. So they were very much aware that they were sort of on their own. So whether anyone knew what Lucy and Suzanne was doing, that's a slightly different question. They say, and I have no reason to doubt them, that only one person knew what they were doing. They had a longtime friend who they allowed into their confidence. But even their maid and her husband, both of whom lived in the house, it was a big enough house that they had servants' quarters, did not seem to know what was going on. So even though there were all of these different acts of resistance happening on the island, Lucy and Suzanne were still in many ways kind of, on their own, because they very much kind of sealed themselves off from the other folks on the island. And they didn't really, I think, understand how much resistance was happening until they were in prison. Because once they were in prison, they began to meet other resistors. They began, the neighbors in the cells around them, they were able to meet other people, pass notes to them, learn from them about what other people had been doing. So I think it's a complicated story, but so on the one hand they're sort of alone, but yet they're part of this larger kind of decentralized effort that's happening on the island.
Yeah, very nice. We have a couple questions about connection to the art scene, or art as itself as a form of resistance. We know that art did play an important role in Nazi Germany in terms of how the regime personified or tried to represent itself. Did these two stay in connection with art circles once they have left for Jersey? Is there any indication about the political connections they may have made with respect to art?
They did stay in touch with friends in Paris. they wrote letters, and they did in fact take some trips before the war started. So they left for Jersey in 1937. They did make another, at least one more trip, maybe two trips back to Paris before the war broke out. And during the war, they actually received some mail that was addressed to Claude Cahun. And it's sort of mysterious exactly how that happened, but it was one of their artist friends from the Paris days had written a letter. And it was an interesting sort of tricky moment, because something like that could have easily blown their cover. They were not using those artist names on Jersey. They were using Lucy and Suzanne. So when this mysterious letter addressed to Claude Cahun arrived, it could have very easily put them in some serious danger. The idea of French expatriates having an alias, it seems suspicious. It seems like it could have led to some sort of, sort of blowing, like I said, blowing their cover. So it all worked out. They didn't get tripped up by that. But that's just an example of the fact that they were still in touch with folks, and people from Paris would come to visit them on Jersey as well. So they were connected. But at the same time, I think part of why they moved to Jersey was to get some distance, not so much distance from the art scene, but distance from the sort of the drama of Paris in the 30s, the deep political division, as I said, people literally fighting in the streets, proto-fascist groups marching, there's numerous infamous episodes in Paris in the 30s. They did continue to work on their art. They did continue to write. They did continue to draw, and of course to take photographs. And some of the photographs that I showed, especially, you could, I think, hopefully tell some of the ones that were on Jersey, ones on the beach, ones with palm trees. Those were photographs that were taken on Jersey as well. So they did continue to do that and to stay somewhat connected to the art scene in Paris, and yet at the same time have some distance from that.
I think for time for one final question here, coming back to your remark about a top-down approach from history, but really trying to get to the ground level to see what's happening there. From a top-down approach, we know that the Nazi regime was something that was built on terror. But then when we look at these women's prison experience, we get a rather unexpected story of it, almost humane in a way.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that really surprised me about the story, that they're not beaten, they're not tortured, they're not executed. It goes against all of the kinds of expectations that we have about people put in a Nazi prison. And in fact, they end up becoming, I won't say friends with the guards, although, as I said, one of the guards writes them a letter after the war, but they form this kind of working relationship with the guards. They are friendly, even if they may not be truly friends, because at the end of the day, this is still a power situation. It's still an occupation. But I would hasten to add that even though they may not have felt or have experienced physical torment from the Nazi guards, they certainly did experience psychological torment. And I think that, because it's very clear in their writing, it's very clear that basically every day they expected to be executed for 8 months, the entire time that they're in prison. And they're only released on VE Day, like moments before the surrender, basically. And even up until then, even up until the very last minute, Lucy in particular, who was always the more pessimistic one, she expected that they would be taken out and executed. And the Nazis were, in fact, the German troops were executing their own men who had deserted, who had mutinied on the island. Again, until very late in the war. So just the sense of the unknown, I think, is something that they had to struggle with, and the unknown in particular around this question of whether they would survive. It's repeatedly clear in the sources that they did not expect to survive the war. They expected to die. But the fact that they did survive doesn't mean, I think, that they were unscathed by that. Certainly they were touched very deeply by that. And Lucy in particular, she was always, as I said, the more depressive, the more, struggling with thoughts and feelings. And after the war, she took sort of a downturn. But yet at the same time, there were these moments, as you said, of humanity among the guards. I mean, these guards were not professional soldiers. They were men who'd been drafted into the war. They were doing their military service. And this was not a hot battle zone. I mean, Jersey was not the Russian front, right? That was a very different experience, right? So things were calm on Jersey, very important, strategically important, but not a place where bullets were flying. And so it didn't have that same kind of intensity. And so as a result, I think the German soldiers ended up treating them relatively well in prison, even with this sort of constant, fear, this constant worry. So it was really kind of a kind of a mixed bag for them, I think, in prison, that psychological torment, and yet at the same time, these friendly acting guards. It's a fascinating part of the story, and for me, I think especially a kind of unexpected angle to the story.
Well, I'm confident that I speak for our audience that this was fantastic. Thank you so very much for bringing these stories to light. My apologies for those of you to whose questions I did not get to, but you can buy the book. Find some answers there. Thank you all very much. And thank you, Professor Jackson.
Well, thank you, Tate. I appreciate it so much for you hosting tonight and posing the questions. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I hope you have a good evening. Thank you.